Chapter 4 is the first of 3 chapters that are part of the Sociology and Social Psychology lecture. The very first chapter here is on sociological theories and social institutions. Sociology is defined by the study of groups. Now, the field of sociology started before the development of psychology itself. Psychology started in 1879, but sociology kind of grew into itself back around the 1830s. The study of groups was kind of an issue that grew out of the idea of anthropology and the activity of entire societies themselves. In fact, both anthropology and sociology kind of went hand in hand in the early 1800s as they developed. So the definition of the field is actually fairly general, but it is not a definition that has really undergone a lot of change since that time. Now, in terms of sociology, there are 4 primary theoretical approaches that we're going to review. In terms of the field of sociology, there are 4 general theoretical approaches that are typically used to try to understand society. These are functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, and social constructionism. And those are what we're going to largely be focused on in this particular chapter. Each of these types of theories will seem somewhat familiar to you because much of sociological theorizing has kind of blended itself in society. You frequently hear of it through news media and so forth. So you may actually be more familiar with these things than you're actually aware. The very first one we start with, functionalism, comes from the idea that society functions like a living thing. It's a metaphor for a process in which you don't have different biochemical components of a cell, but you actually have, let's say, 1 million people living on an island, and those individuals interact with each other. It makes it so that the interaction between the 1 million people on the island are functioning in a way so that the overall social processes function to create a culture. So all the various attributes of society contribute to the overall functioning and all the possible ways that things can interact. Now, if you hear this, one of the ideas that you should be getting is this is extremely broad thinking, right? You would say, well, okay, I could see this kind of showing up in the 1800s, given that's like the beginning of the field of sociology. But what about now? Now when you take a look at sociology, the same ideas still exist, except there has to be some more specific types of data that you would work with. But the ideas still exist in that fairly general form. So this, as well as the remaining theories, all tend to be fairly general in nature. Some of the aspects of this general theoretical idea of how society functions kind of come from what you see here on the bottom of the slide. The idea that social facts are elements that create functions in society, which simply means that things that actually are occurring or that people perceive, and perception is very important in sociology, the things that people perceive, which you would then refer to as a social fact, are the things that most people tend to focus upon. And it's those particular aspects that people focus on with respect to society. So one example, I think, from your review manual was the role of education. The role of education has 3 components: a manifest, latent, and social function. And the manifest function of education is to get people in society educated. Manifest function simply refers to what is the explicit intention of what you're supposed to do. Now, anytime you do something, given the fact that you're a human being and you can perceive things differently, and that's really kind of the key issue here, there's always going to be some other process that also occurs that you might notice. For example, a latent function. The latent function of education may produce things like social differences between individuals. Because education costs money, people that can afford to have an education get an education if they want one. But for the people that cannot afford an education, they can't get one because they can't afford it. Even if they want to get the education, they can't afford it. And then that, to some degree, may cause differences in society. So whereas you're intending to educate the population of your society, of the 1 million people on the island that you live on, you are both going to add education into the population, but then you're also going to cause social differences because some people simply can't get educated because they can't afford it. And then some of those aspects result in things like social dysfunction, aspects where there are components in which individuals generate problems in society as a direct result, or at least as a secondary result, of the role of education in this example. The second theoretical approach is conflict theory. Now, you probably are familiar with conflict theory and don't even realize it. It was a theory over time developed between three people, Marx, Gumplowitz, and Weber. And Marx is Karl Marx, the founder or developer of communism. And that is going to make a lot more sense to you now, given the way things are presented in national media systems today. For example, as you might imagine, if the person who created the concept of communism was part of a sociological theory, you might imagine that that kind of communistic thinking, like the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie and conflict in society as being a primary aspect of how society is developed, would actually fit into this sociological theory here. And you would be correct. In conflict theory, society is always understood as a competition for limited resources. There's not always enough food or money or services and so forth to go around, and people have to compete for it. And as a result, the people that compete successfully gather up more and more resources and then have very little difficulty obtaining anything else they need. And some people wind up getting pushed to the bottom on essentially a purely random basis. It's just your bad luck through life that you did not have resources or could not compete successfully with somebody that had quite a bit more than you, and you simply wind up going down the social ranks. So this assumption that inequality is natural and is always going to occur is the basis for conflict theory. And in fact, so individuals that work in conflict theory today oftentimes focus on anything that is related to differences that you see in society. For example, gender pay inequality. Whether or not this is something that occurs because of the personal life choices between males and females about staying home, raising kids, the careers that they choose, and so forth, or whether or not it's due to explicit patriarchal effects of society, is not being explained here. It's just pointing out that there's gender pay inequality. And as a result, it fits under conflict theory because the assumption is the pay in a company is something that people are going to compete for. And so if males start earning more and males take roles of higher position in the company, then they may reduce the payments or salaries to females in the company as a way to save money. And then overall, you're going to wind up with this net pay inequality. Conflict theory stresses aspects of differences between groups and the way in which they change naturally through social function. So the assumption is typically that institutions within societies have particular characteristics and they influence each other over time. It isn't necessarily something related to a revolution, a violent revolution, but just kind of the interaction of social institutions. Now, one of the outgrowths that you see from conflict theory is feminism. And this is something I think is very necessary that you grasp. The whole concept of feminism, which you hear about in society today, is a direct result of its outgrowth from conflict theory. And this largely starts sometime back around the 1950s into the 60s, really starts to come to prominence during the 1960s. And the idea is that there is an overarching structure of patriarchy in society, that society favors men and disfavors women. And as a result, women always wind up taking a second-class role. Now, keep this in mind. This is an outgrowth from conflict theory. So the assumption in feminist theory in general is that there is just an automatic inequality between men and women, and somehow, magically, I suppose, men always come out on top in every single case. And that's sort of the basis that you actually see in terms of feminism. And we're actually going to see a further development of that on the next slide in a short video I'm going to show you. Now, the things about sociological views, they get expressed through conflict theory on television, usually as identified as the crazy liberals, right? This is, from when you look at national news systems like Fox News and CNN, you are probably very aware that the news media takes particular political views. They're not addressing news in and of itself just to let people in society know that something happened, but specifically they take a particular viewpoint, usually like kind of a Republican or a Democratic viewpoint, and they judge the news from that standpoint rather than just presenting it. And this is very much what happens on the conservative news media stations, because whenever the conservative news stations talk about events, they are always talking about how there are socialists out there and feminists, and the socialists and the feminists are trying to undermine society and get rid of capitalism. And it's a whole large story that I'm sure you're familiar with hearing. That story directly comes out of conflict theory from sociology. Although no one on television ever talks about this, and of course they wouldn't talk about it because then they'd really be outing the process that they present the news in. But conflict theory presents the manner in which a story of conflict or battle is presented to society, thereby making a more interesting story. And so for these conservative news stations, they always refer back to some general set of socialists or some general set of feminists that are out there that are kind of doing things, and almost like they're having these special meetings and sending out word that everybody has to start using particular pronouns and so forth, and they act like it's a real thing, and it's extremely important, and you must obey immediately, and they're there to kind of identify that this is all nonsense. Right? It's the whole game that the whole system plays. So what I'm going to show you here is a clip for about 3.5 minutes from Fox News. And by the way, this is a Fox News clip, but you could get the exact same type of thing from CNN, who would do a very liberal view and would demean a Republican or conservative viewpoint. But we don't have to spend all day looking at one versus the other. This one in particular is so whacked out. I find it somewhat amusing. And given what I just told you about how sociological theory of conflict theory specifically establishes the basis by which news media for conservative stations presents information, I hope to kind of tie together all these possible loose ends for you so that you understand where this information comes from.
Well, America has experienced a rapid, in fact, a massive inflation in genders. At one point, biologists were allowed to determine what biology was, and there were two, male and female. Now there's agender, bigender, two-spirit, hydra. We could go on forever, literally forever, because the core orthodoxy is that there are infinite genders. But not everyone agrees. Some people believe in science. At their peril, it turns out. Lake Engel is one of them. He's a student at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. In a religion class, a class about Christianity, he stated his belief that there are two genders because, again, that's biology. And for that, he was told he had to apologize in front of the class, stand silently while they critiqued him, re-education camp stuff. Lake Engel joins us tonight. Lake, thanks for coming up.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
So I don't know if I was mischaracterizing that. You had this professor called Allison Downey who was so threatened because you disagreed with her that she tried to get you to sign some form apologizing for your unorthodox, non-allowed thoughts, and then what happened?
Right, yeah, she asked that I would sign a document complying with her asking me to apologize to the class as well as giving her a written apology. She asked that I would stand in front of the class in silence as I apologized, and then they would give any comments on my outbursts.
Did she say what specifically she was so offended by?
She didn't like the fact that I disagreed with the subject being pushed in class being more than one gender, male privilege, systemic sexism, and mansplaining.
Is mansplaining a measurable thing? I mean, is it a species of social science studying mansplaining? What is mansplaining anyway? Do you know? Did you learn?
I'm not sure. I think it's any time a man speaks, really.
Huh.
And
so
no, it isn't measurable.
What did you, right, I mean, it's a species of dumbness, really. So, but what did you, it's propaganda, what did you say about gender that made her so mad, specifically?
Well, I first referenced entities like The Economist who have debunked the myth of the 77 cents on the dollar wage gap. And I also stated that biologists don't agree that there are more than two genders. They don't believe that there are 72 genders or more across the board. Most of them disagree, and she really didn't appreciate that.
So by citing the longstanding view of biologists, the hard scientists, Allison Downey, who supposedly, you say she's a professor, tried to get you to stand in front of the class and take abuse. Did you do that?
No, I didn't. I was supposed to, but she really didn't give me a chance. I was given 10 days to comply, but the day after she asked this of me, she decided to push it on through to the university's provost office to then hold a hearing, which would decide whether or not it could be allowed in class, period.
Why do you go to this school? Or why does anybody go to this school or any other school? I mean, what are you getting out of this exactly?
Well, I initially went for athletics my freshman year, but that's a long-gone dream now. I'm pretty much just stuck here.
Man, I wish I could hire you. I would encourage you and anyone else who has any experience like this to drop out and join the workforce. It's not worth it. This is a joke. It's a bubble, and we're all going to realize that in 10 years. Like, you're a brave man for coming on. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
So you see from this clip The role of feminist theory and the way it's presented in a very conflict theory version, that there is this concept of 72 genders, and that there's a feminist teacher in a religious class that's demanding everybody accept it and then punishing an individual for not doing so. Why these particular events actually took place, oddly enough, in all places like a religion class, seems to be unknown at this point, at least from the evidence that we have from this one particular clip. But it certainly is played out in the way that there are crazy liberals out there making all sorts of wacky decisions that are going to undermine society. And that, again, is the primary basis by which conservative media outlets generally get their information. But as I mentioned, the same thing is also true in the reverse. So for MSNBC or CNN that have very liberal approaches in terms of their news presentations, they do the same sort of thing against the Republicans, which of course always calls them, a white ruling class of men that will not allow life to change in the country and only want to drag everybody back into the past. And that's kind of the rap that you get from the liberal media stations. But it's good to see this in the broader story of these sociological theories, that one of them has actually gotten so popular that you darn near hear about it every day, just not actually identified by name or the real underlying processes for why you're hearing about it. But that moves us on to the less interesting, or at least less fun, symbolic interactionism. The theoretical approach of symbolic interactionism looks a lot like functionalism, and frankly, there's a lot of overlap between the two. There's just some minor detail in the way things are described between these. When you take a look at these descriptions on the screen, you're talking about how the molecular effects in society are going to wind up producing macro effect changes, so that interactions between people or small institutions will build up into a large way to produce kind of an overall society, or the functional process of the overarching aspects of society. And there's nothing in functionalism, the first theory that we looked at, that's really kind of doesn't go along with this idea. Functionalism just talked about these differences or these kinds of effects in a general sense, whereas symbolic interactionism is talking about specifically how individual small institutions or interactions between individuals build up into much larger processes. But that, of course, is completely functional. So there's really a substantial overlap in the theorizing of functionalism and symbolic interactionism. Much of symbolic interactionism, the parts that kind of make it somewhat more unique, are based upon the role of subjective meaning between individuals, how people believe or perceive events in life, because it's primarily their beliefs that are the basis for the interactions between people in society, thereby doing one of these odd sociological things that you sometimes also hear about in popular science processes, like the idea that there is a reality and then there's what you perceive. And in this particular case for symbolic interactionism, it's your beliefs that are the basis for your interactions. And what I would say as a psychologist is that perceptions are very important. That's generally the terminology I would use as a psychologist. Perceptions are much more important than reality, because it's your perceptions that actually drive your behavior. So cases like this, you sometimes see things like people make arguments where they'll say 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's reality. And anybody that says 2 plus 2 does not equal 4 is just wrong. But sociologists will wind up saying, 2 plus 2 equals apple, but only if everybody thinks so. Now, it doesn't make 2 plus 2 actually in reality equal apple. What actually is happening, the point that sociologists make in cases like this, is that if everybody believes 2 plus 2 equals apple, then that's the perceptual reality that everybody plays by. It doesn't really change anything outside of your body. It doesn't change the way the universe operates. But if everybody holds these beliefs, then everybody treats the beliefs as though they're true, and that's part of the basis to society itself. And so, in a more realistic sense, not talking about 2 plus 2 equaling apple, if you were to say, for example, I don't believe gene therapy will ever cure blood diseases, right? And, maybe you have a good theoretical argument for that back in the 1950s. And if most other scientists believe that, what that really is ultimately going to mean is that with that belief that genetic treatments won't treat blood diseases, nobody, or at least very few people, will ever try to cure blood diseases with a genetic approach. And the handful of people that actually get involved are going to take a much longer time before, even if they ever do develop some sort of useful treatment from a genetic standpoint. So it may not change whether or not genes can affect blood disorders, but it will affect the rate at which people do uncover effects like this, and it also redirects where grant money would go. Because if the granting institution says no, genetic effects are never going to wind up affecting any kind of blood disease we're ever aware of, then how much grant money is actually going to go toward the genetic treatment of blood diseases, right? Zero, which means no treatment will ever be developed in that case. And under those circumstances, an example like this is where sociologists are actually much more correct. It's not 2 plus 2 equals apple. It's if everybody holds the same belief, it's going to affect the way that their pattern of behavior is, the way they interact in the world, and that itself may have some very grand effects. The last theory to look at is social constructionism. And again, you're going to see a lot of overlap between social constructionism and the symbolic interactionism and functionalism as well. They're all kind of very basic. Conflict theory itself kind of stands out separately. Not that it denies that interactions between people affect society, but conflict theory so much focuses on conflict, it doesn't necessarily look at any other type of interaction in society as actually being that important. Now, as far as social constructionism goes, it is part of how people create a reality through their interactions, which does overlap with the 2 plus 2 equals apple example that I just gave you. You certainly see that here as well. Research in the area of social constructionism tends to focus on how people create a reality by their interactions with others and social institutions. So again, when you say you create a reality, obviously it does not mean the physical reality outside your body, but the perceptual reality, the things you believe that are relevant and not relevant, and therefore the manner in which your behavior is controlled as you interact with people in society. So oftentimes, people in social constructionism will talk about how average effects, or the most common types of things, become more readily recognized by individuals, and therefore those things tend to be stressed in society. So, for example, across society, most people tend to be heterosexual, well over 90%. And in fact, very consistently, when you look at marriage, the male tends to be older than the female actually in a process that takes place across the entire globe. It doesn't mean that you can't have a marriage between an older woman and a younger man, but statistically, that's unlikely to occur. So it doesn't make these things happen. It's just that the average likelihood of something occurring tends to be stressed rather than the less likely scenarios. And this, of course, leads to social functioning that may denigrate somebody that functions within the smaller probability, right? So if you're a 20-year-old male who marries a 35-year-old woman, everybody may say congratulations at your wedding, but then everybody, of course, is going to be talking behind your back saying, oh my God, why'd he marry somebody so much older than him? But if, of course, it was reversed, a 35-year-old man marrying a 20-year-old woman, it would be a different story. She's too young for him, possibly, or, maybe he's lucky to have gotten somebody so much younger. There would be a different way in which people would actually view the whole process. Same sort of thing you see in the examples in education. Education in terms of social constructionism may be open to everybody, but once you get into school, everybody's value to education is going to be based upon merit, how well you do in school once you're there. And so you're going to order everybody based upon their grades from A down to F, and the people with the A's are going to be considered the most important, and then the B's and the C's and the D's and the F's after that. And so your performance in school winds up affecting your place in society. And that's the primary issue. And anybody look at that and say, sure, somebody who got straight A's in a biochemistry program probably knows better biochemistry than somebody who got straight D's. And you're probably correct, right? I don't see a reason to argue against that. All the sociologist is doing is pointing out the fact that your grade in your program affects what position you're going to wind up taking in society, what kind of job you're going to take, and how much respect you're going to get from your colleagues. That's the thing that they're pointing out. So you can't take it really as a judgmental thing. I think oftentimes aspects of sociology are used in a judgmental fashion, but that may be my tendency to believe that simply because so much of conflict theory emanates the public discussion of life in the United States, in fact, in other industrialized societies as well, so that it may seem like the judgmentalness of these theories actually dominates, whereas that just may be kind of a media issue in which people take these concepts and misuse them in a judgmental fashion. Now, this moves us on to a discussion of some social institutions. Many of these things, there really is not a whole lot to talk about. Sociologists, being the individuals that study how society develops, certainly are going to take a look at the ways in which people organize themselves. And in fact, families are going to be a very common thing. There are no human societies in which there are no families in existence, right? That everybody is just completely separate from each other. And because families are common to human societies, sociologists are going to slice up the ways in which families are designed, because there are different types of families, different types of structures of families, and the roles that families play are typically fairly common. These are not necessarily universal across the board. because societies could have different rules, but these 5 aspects of the role of the family are fairly common around the globe. Influencing reproduction, monitoring of sexual behavior. Certainly, in the U.S., parents watch probably more so their daughters than their sons regarding early sexual activity, making sure that their daughters don't get pregnant, probably laying down the law, being more heavy-handed with their daughters than their sons. Protection from all things, legal protection, physical protection from other people like bullies and so forth. Socialization, affection, companionship, and even social status. How well your parents do in life winds up affecting the location that you start in social status as you're 18 years of age. All these things wind up affecting people. And the specific way in which these things influence a family is based on a myriad of differences depending upon the society and period of time and culture that you're talking about. It's really just up to you and your imagination to determine the different ways that each of those 5 processes could influence a family. So there's almost an unending supply of discussion that can occur in this case. And this is a little bit, I would say, unfortunate aspect of sociology, that it's so broad that even now, after nearly 200 years as a field of study, that you still have these very loosey-goosey broad view of human behavior, that we don't have more rules with clearer parameters to focus our attention on exactly what one thing will do. But it is what it is, and this is what sociology is generally offering you at the current time. So even when you look at the bottom of the page here, nuclear family and extended family, the whole issue of monogamy and polygamy and the ways in which it can occur, each one of those processes affects a culture differently depending upon how it's designed, the rules of it, and so forth. So there's essentially an unending supply of imaginative combinations that could occur. We had talked about education before in the functionalism process. And we talked about the aspects of manifest and latent function. They are exactly the same thing here. Manifest function of education is simply to educate members of your population. The latent function does other things that you're not purposely intending to occur, but that will actually occur. Like the fact that children are socialized in school. And that socialism is very important because children get to be around peers, they get to play, they do academic work, they share things, they talk, they learn how to be human beings in their society by simply being around other individuals of the same age. Of course, education changes them over time. There are status symbols, right? There are teacher's pet, kids that always get answers right. There is the dumb kid or the kid who can't pay attention well, and they will be treated differently because their grades are poor or they always answer questions incorrectly. It also helps maintain social control, which is another aspect that sociologists will tend to focus on because they'll talk about how the structure of society, in this particular case, the structure of an educational system winds up influencing social control. What are you taught in your textbook, right? Are you always told, as maybe 150 years ago, that Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Western Hemisphere was a great thing? Or the more likely scenario that you hear now, the presence of Christopher Columbus in the Bahamas just begins 500 years of oppression, domination, and war that kills off millions of people. Different ways to look at it. And, it depends on who wrote the textbook, who bought the textbook, how the textbook is being used. And a lot of discussion, in fact, if you go back to these national media systems, this is one of those topics that they tend to argue about. As school boards address the material in history books that are in middle schools, for example, to make sure that all parts of society are represented equally or at least fairly, that aspects of social status or different types of bias do not fit into the history books, and that these books get reviewed. Usually people on conservative news stations will talk about how the socialists are trying to get in there and rewrite history and ignore all the good things that Christopher Columbus or somebody else might have done, who might have their role changed in a history book. And of course, the opposite is true as well. If you're going to talk about who were the best bankers in early America, you almost certainly would get pushback from the liberal side. But this being on a media process where you would do the arguing in that case about whether or not early America was run by rich white men that only sought to dominate economically anybody they possibly could. These kinds of arguments are things that you hear about all the time. But again, they play themselves out in the national news media because that, just in our current time period that we all live in, is how national news media has shaped itself. Right, as a free press, as a society with a free press, this is what they've decided to do, mainly because they can make more profits selling advertisement time by generating these conflicting stories or arguments. It always kind of comes back to conflict theory is what you're actually seeing. A story about society in which there is no conflict quickly becomes boring. And you would know that from going to any action movie. All right, you can't have an action movie with lots of excitement if there's no tension, and that's just a storytelling technique that everybody's aware of. And if your job, your full-time career, is to tell stories like a newscaster does, then you're very aware of the need for conflict. And then it's not surprising that news media systems fall back on conflict theory for much of the basis of what they actually do. Now, education in general, despite whether or not people are just making up stories, does have these latent and manifest functions. And economic disparities do occur in schooling. As I've mentioned before, there are aspects of dysfunction in schooling systems that are not necessarily directly coming out of the schooling system itself, but rather the broader society in which it lives. How, if there's 4 schools, for example, and there's $1 million available, how come each school just doesn't get $250,000 right off the bat, right? There's the county or the city will have a particular system by which they determine how much money should go to each school. And that entire system often involves a lot of horse trading and argument and favors being done for people back and forth. So it's not just an automatic fair process, but there's a lot of haggling over where the money actually goes, to a great degree based upon how much political will or political power a particular group may have in their own neighborhood. As a result, some schools tend to be funded well, other schools tend to be funded very poorly. And that is something I'm going to go through and show you here. Now, even though this issue is probably fairly obvious, what we're going to do is take a short look at a difference between two schools for you to look behind what's being said in the video. Because in this video really only does what's happening on the face of things. It is not describing why things are happening the way they are. You have to actually be smarter than just looking at the face of things and try to understand why is it tax dollars are not being divided up equally between the schools, especially when one school has clear need for improvement and the other one has a lot of a really high standard, that there isn't some more equity in the process. But let's take a look at this video.
My name is Cedric Forte. I'm a junior at Heritage High School, 425.
My name is Jackson Langvort. I'm 18-year-old and I'm a senior at McLean High School. For academic subjects, I'm in Advanced Placement Literature,
English,
Advanced Placement U.S. Government,
Biology,
and Comparative Government,
Art,
Advanced Placement Music Theory,
Health,
Geosystems for Science,
and Algebra.
Men's Chorus,
What's it?
Leadership, and Technical Theater. So I drive and I get here half an hour before school starts every day, just for the fun of it. Trying to park here, if you come in at normal time, is really awful. You end up parking like half a mile away.
A lot of students who go to a school all the way across town have to catch 2 and 3 buses in the subway just to get to school. And I think that, if we have to travel that far just to get education, then we should be able to travel for free.
The kids here are motivated in just about everything. They're motivated to even learn, which is scary to hear for a high school kid. They're motivated to succeed in sports, extracurriculars, anything.
I think they've lost the will to learn. A lot of them. They just don't find school interesting no more because they don't have the power to do anything. And they say so in the classrooms.
This is our auditorium and theater. We have lights, standard light sound. It's not particularly high tech, but we have a nice system.
Here, go to the metal detector. They use this to try to, keep school safe, but obviously it doesn't work because, even when someone walks through and it beeps, they don't even search them or anything. They just say, okay, walk back through, empty your pockets. That's all they do.
This is our new studio. It's one of 3 high schools in the county who has it. Hey, orchestra, can you start playing? Okay. It's all kids. It's all run. It's all performed. It's all produced by kids.
Well, one thing that these walls, they really need to be repainted because of the graffiti. As you can see here, they tried to repaint it, but it doesn't blend in. You can actually tell they just, really just gave up on repainting the walls. So every teacher in this school buys their own school supplies. And it's actually very sad because, the school system should have money to, provide for those school supplies for students, but they don't. And the teachers have to come out of their paychecks just to, be able to support their students.
That's our observatory. It's a giant dome with a telescope, and you can see the entire sky from there. If every school in the country can be like McLean, I think it's really going to increase standard of living, just going to make things a lot better.
Obviously, it's not fair. We have not even half of what they have. We're all students. Why shouldn't we receive the things that they have? We're all trying to learn. We all want to grow up to be something, so why shouldn't we receive the same advantages they have? I don't understand that.
Other social institutions that wind up affecting much of the theorizing in sociology come from religion. Here again, there's not a whole lot to really discuss. There are just these 4 various groupings of religions. Ecclesia, which is a dominant religion that does not allow for other religions to exist. Lutheranism, up in Sweden, and countries oftentimes with Islamic structures built into the government system itself do not allow for other religions. Churches, sects, and cults, all fairly straightforward ways of describing things. A cult may seem to be something outside of society's norm, but once enough people join the cult tends not to be a cult anymore, and it simply becomes a church. And so as sociologists and anthropologists like to point out that Christianity at one time, roughly 2,000 years ago, was a cult itself. But it developed in its numbers until it eventually became a church. And so as a church, which was only essentially one type of church, the Catholic Church initially, eventually started to break out into separate types of sects, primarily after the Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther. So the Protestants who got their name from protesting, that is Protestant or protest, they were the protesters to the Catholic Church. And then after the general Protestants were developed, Protestantism broke off into many subsects after that, like Episcopalian and Baptist and so forth, and are even still now subdividing themselves further. Social institutions in terms of government and economy, again, follows the same rules with religion and family. There is a myriad way to discuss how any of these processes wind up affecting society. Is essentially limited to your own imagination. But let's take a look at each of these different ones. Rational legal authority is the one that we are supposed to have in the United States. The idea here is that it's rational because it was created through a group effort where people are trying to create a fair system. That fair, rational system is set into law, and so that everybody is supposed to be treated equally under the law. Right? That's the intention. And of course, that doesn't necessarily have to happen, whether it's the United States or somewhere else, but that's the original intention of a rational legal authority. A traditional authority is going to be based upon whatever is the traditional authority of a particular culture. So it may come from religion, for example, that if the legal institutions are primarily based off of religious thinking, then the religious leaders are the traditional authority. But there could be different variations of this, like traditional authority could come from the types of skills that you have and the job that you entail, and so that each group of individuals that has a different task in society creates their own laws for that particular area. A charismatic authority refers to an individual who usually for likely a much shorter period of time than the above two, gets everybody gelled in society and behind him or her because they are very charismatic. So in a case like this, you would have like an Adolf Hitler, who got lots of people behind him, got a lot of social support during that time that he was leader, until, of course, the end of World War II, where there was no more charisma as Germany was being destroyed, and so Hitler would have been on his way out anyway. Capitalism and socialism, those should be pretty easy. You understand capitalism because you live in a capitalist society. Socialism is essentially capitalism with some government intervention to force equity across groups. So there are instances where taxes will be taken across society so that individuals without services can be supplied them. Usually in a socialist manner, it's going to be a handout of some sort, which is probably much higher than you might see in any kind of welfare system in a capitalist society like our own. And health and medicine, where we wind up, and I have a few videos to show you after this point. Health and medicine are related to society because not all things that are medical in nature necessarily are held to the same degree of importance by members of society. And in fact, not all disorders are treated universally. For one example here, ADHD and depression are not universally considered disorders around the globe. There are places where depression is just you deciding to not do anything. You became lazy after your wife died and didn't go to work anymore. Or the ADHD is not a real effect. It's something where people used to just call somebody stupid. They were stupid or lazy and they weren't trying hard enough, but now they're going to be diagnosed with ADHD. And of course, that's another thing you sort of see people argue with on TV because it just causes conflict. But, there are other instances of this. Maybe Epstein-Barr was probably one of the ones that I was first aware of a couple of decades ago, as Epstein-Barr as a disorder was presented as a questionable disorder. And as time has gone by, it seems to have been diagnosed into a real disorder now. Focus on prevention and treatment for health and medicine requires resources. If you want to keep, and we'll say this in air quotes, your society sanitary and healthful, you have to put out more effort up front to establish that people exercise, have clean water, that the food supply chain is sanitary, and all of this takes a lot of effort and money. But in a very poor country, you don't have money to do this. You just have to let people do things the way they do them and kind of hope for the best and hope that people use common sense to wash off the vegetables and smell the meat before they cook it and to cut off the rotten portions and to not expose themselves unnecessarily to unsanitary conditions. And, all of these aspects that really kind of fall upon the individual are really just cost-saving measures oftentimes in a poorer country because there's no possible way you can establish a health department that will constantly go out and evaluate things for sanitary conditions. One of the ways in which you oftentimes think of health and medicine is through the biopsychosocial model, which will be discussed in greater detail in later lectures, but you may remember it from previous lectures and other courses you have had. The biopsychosocial approach is the primary way to understand both medical and psychological disorders today. That every disorder has a biological component, a psychological component to it that may affect the biological one as well as a social component. So things like COVID-19, for example, certainly has a biological component because you can identify the virus. But at the current time, as I record this video, there is no vaccine or treatment for coronavirus. And as a result, it will cause a great deal of anxiety. Anxiety being caused during the virus may actually agitate quite a number of the symptoms. In fact, when you look at the symptoms for COVID-19, many of the symptoms are things that you could actually generate through a placebo effect, like a temperature or an upset stomach or diarrhea or muscle cramps or joints that ache. Those are all things that actually could be created because you thought they were going to occur. And that would certainly agitate the symptoms of the problem. And with agitated symptoms, how are people going to treat you? Well, they're going to, at the current time, they're going to require you to isolate yourself. and that itself may cause more problems, which will further agitate your anxiety, which may actually enable further the virus to influence you simply because you are under greater stress. So those three things do work together in traditional biological medicine as well as psychological effects. And those are all things that you have to be very aware of. Now, to finish up this chapter, we're actually going to watch 3 movies. Having come off of health and medicine, the 3 movies that we're going to watch are actually all related to these things, and they are things that you should be aware of as a potential graduate from medical school. The first one is related to Medicare and Medicaid. The second video is going to be related to costs of hospital stays and medical treatment today. And the last one is going to be kind of a further extension of the issue of medical costs. But I will give you a short narration of each of these videos afterward. This first one, though, is very straightforward. What is Medicaid and Medicare?
Your Medicare plan is out there. Let's find it together.
Well, what exactly is Medicare?
Medicare is a federal program that provides health insurance for people ages 65 and older and those with certain disabilities.
How does it work?
Let's start with the basics. There are 4 different parts to Medicare, plus another optional component we'll talk about later. We'll begin with Original Medicare, made up of Parts A and B. Part A is your hospital insurance. This helps pay for inpatient stays, skilled nursing facilities, and hospice care. Part B is your medical insurance. This covers things like doctor visits, ambulance rides, lab tests, and medical equipment such as wheelchairs.
What about the other parts?
There's also Part D, an optional prescription drug plan that's separate from Original Medicare. Each plan defines a list of covered drugs and the pharmacies where you can get them.
Wait, did you skip a letter?
We didn't forget about Part C, more commonly known as Medicare Advantage. Private insurers offer these plans as an alternative to Original Medicare. They provide all necessary coverage in one convenient plan and with only one card to keep track of. Most Medicare Advantage plans also include prescription drug coverage and other added benefits like dental, vision, hearing, and even fitness memberships. But Medicare Advantage plans aren't the only way to get additional coverage. Medigap plans, also called Medicare supplements, help cover the copays and deductibles that Original Medicare doesn't pay for. These plans are sold by private insurers, but the various plan types are standardized by the government. These supplemental plans can only be combined with Original Medicare, meaning you can choose Medicare Advantage or Medicare supplements, but not both. So there you have it, the ABCs and D of Medicare. If you're ready to find a plan now, get started on Medicareful.com. Want to talk with someone first? Give us a call.
Okay, so that video just talked about the differences between Medicaid and Medicare. Certainly those are things you're going to have to be aware of. They are related to sociology in the fact that society is actually setting up these systems, and they are primarily determined to capture the people with the least amount of money to save them from getting absolutely no medical care whatsoever. One of the extensions of the story of high prices for the healthcare system come from the story of the movie Sicko, where Michael Moore goes to England, amongst other places, and talks about how well a medical doctor can do under the national health system that Britain has. The British system is certainly not perfect, as I've mentioned. as a psychologist, I can't say there is a single social system of any type in which every single person from that society is served perfectly well, right? It's a problem beyond our own intellectual capacity to design at the current time. There's just no way to make everybody happy when you're talking about millions of people. But Michael Moore does his usual fairly biased view of work, but at least he gets to show something that I have to kind of tie between the last video and the current one. When you look at an American doctor, they will make scads of money, and that may be one of the reasons why you want to go into medicine, because you're going to be very, very rich as a result. It's a lucrative field. Where does that money come from that you get paid so much? Well, you actually just kind of saw that in the previous video. You can be really, you can make a lot of money as a medical doctor in the United States, in part because of the exorbitant prices that are charged people for any kind of treatment. So even though many people may have medical insurance and only have to pay a $25 copay when they go to the doctor for something, the amount that they're actually making from the insurance company is actually quite a bit more. And ultimately, all of that comes back to members of society and how much they have to pay for their insurance premium. So when you hear about somebody has a COBRA premium of $3,000 a month, that's really indicative of the fact that the medical doctors themselves and the insurance company are both making a lot of money. And, the money just doesn't magically appear. It's got to come from somewhere. And ultimately, just like with taxes, it's going to come from the members of society. So, being rich is great. Going to medical school is even better. But it's good for you to realize where the money's actually coming from. Whether you care or not is a separate story altogether. And so here you see a medical doctor in Britain and his nice lifestyle, despite the fact that he earns considerably less than an American doctor doing the same work.
I was wondering, though, what's it like for the doctors here in Britain who have to live under this kind of state control?
And you're a family doctor?
Yeah, I suppose we'd call them GPs or general practitioners here.
Right, so you have like a family practice of...
Yeah, it's an NHS practice. We have 9 doctors within that practice. And
you're paid for by the government?
Paid for by the government,
So you work for the government?
Oh yeah,
you're
absolutely.
a government paid doctor?
Absolutely.
A patient comes to see you. Before you treat them, do you have to call the government insurance company before you can treat them?
No, I don't deal with money at all on an everyday basis.
Have you ever had to say no to someone who was sick and needed help?
No, never.
Have you heard of anyone being in the hospital and being removed because they couldn't pay their bill?
No, never, and I wouldn't want to work in that system.
So working for the government, you probably have to use public transportation?
No, so I have a car that I use, and I drive.
An old beater? You live in a kind of rough part of town, or?
I live in a terrific part of town. It's called Greenwich. It's a lovely house. It's a 3-story house.
How many other families have to live in that house with you?
No, so we would live. There's 4 bedrooms, but my wife and my son. It's just the 3 of us there.
How much do you pay for that?
550,000. Yeah. So,
pounds.
Yeah.
So $1 million.
Yeah.
You're a government-paid doctor.
Yes.
On a national health insurance health care plan here.
Yes.
And you live in $1 million home.
Yes. I think probably my friends think we do quite well.
Really? How well do you do?
I earn around 85,000, including pension.
85,000 pounds?
85,000 pounds a year, and that includes pension that they would pay into me. They probably earn just over 100,000 pounds within my practice.
100,000 pounds, so that's almost $200,000.
Yes, absolutely. The money that we earn, we get paid by what we do. So the better we do for our patients, then the more that we get paid.
What do you mean?
There's a new system, and in that new system, if the most number of your patients have low blood pressures, or you get most of your patients to stop smoking, or you get most of your patients to have things like mental health reviews if they're unwell or low cholesterols, then you get paid more.
In other words, this year, if you get more people that are your patients to stop smoking,
yes,
you'll get more money.
Yes, absolutely.
This year, you'll earn more.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So doctors in America do not necessarily have to fear having a universal health care.
No, I think if you want to have $2 or $3 million homes and 4 or 5 nice cars and 6 or 7 nice televisions, then maybe, yeah, you need to practice somewhere where you can earn that. But I think we live comfortably here, and London's an expensive city, but I think we live very comfortably.
And you're getting by okay on the $1 million home, the Audi, and the flat screen TV.
Yeah, we're coping with those.